What if the civilization we call modern is not a peak, but a pale shadow of something that came before? What if the libraries were burned, the maps redrawn, and the cities buried so thoroughly that even the memory of what was lost has been erased? For centuries, a single name appeared on the world's most important maps, stretching across half the globe in bold, unapologetic letters: Tartaria. A name so vast, so prominent, and yet today so completely absent from every history textbook, every university lecture, every documentary broadcast on mainstream television. The question is not simply what Tartaria was. The question is why we are not supposed to ask. What follows is not a comfortable story. It is the story of a civilization potentially so advanced, so powerful, and so deliberately erased that its absence may be the greatest unsolved mystery in all of human history. Strange architecture that defies explanation, maps that were altered, cities swallowed by earth, technology hinted at in the very bones of buildings we still walk past today. This is the Tartarian Empire mystery, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Part 1: The name that vanished from the world. Open any European map from the 16th or 17th century, and it will stare back at you with unmistakable authority. Spread across the northern and central regions of Asia, covering territories that would today encompass parts of Russia, China, Mongolia, Kazakhstan, and Siberia, the word Tartaria dominates the cartographic landscape. Not tucked into a corner, not written in small, hesitant letters. It is enormous, confident. The kind of label cartographers reserve for empires they take seriously. Maps produced by the greatest European cartographic houses of the age, Ortelius, Bliu, Mercator, all carry the name: Independent Tartary, Chinese Tartary, Mughal Tartary, Great Tartary. These were not vague labels slapped on blank spaces. They were deliberate designations for regions with known rulers, recognized cultures, and distinct identities. When travelers from Europe ventured east and wrote back about their journeys, they described cities of stone rising from the steppes, rulers commanding armies of frightening discipline, and technologies for agriculture and warfare that rivaled or exceeded European standards. Then something changed. By the mid-19th century, the name had essentially disappeared. New maps showed the same territories divided into the political units we recognize today: Russia extending across Siberia, China dominating the east, and a scattering of smaller states filling in the gaps. Tartaria was gone, not gradually absorbed, not renamed after some famous battle or treaty, simply gone, replaced, overwritten, and the explanations offered by historians have always sounded strangely incomplete. The standard academic answer is dismissive. Tartaria, they say, was never a real empire. It was a vague geographic term used by Europeans to describe lands they did not properly understand. As exploration improved and national borders clarified, the name was replaced with something more accurate: case closed. But consider what that explanation actually requires you to accept. It demands that the most sophisticated mapmakers in European history, men who built reputations and fortunes on accuracy, who corresponded with explorers, ambassadors, and merchants across the known world, were collectively using a single label for half a continent simply because they didn't know any better. It demands that hundreds of separate records, travel accounts, diplomatic dispatches, and commercial reports describing Tartaria were all somehow imprecise, that everyone who wrote about it was confused. This explanation stretches credulity, because what we know about the history of cartography is that mapmakers were fiercely competitive and obsessively detail-oriented. They did not lazily repeat labels. They updated, refined, and corrected constantly. For Tartaria to persist on maps for over 2 centuries, there had to be something real anchoring it there, something that enough people experienced directly to keep the name alive. And then there are the specific anomalies. Certain editions of well-known maps show Tartaria prominently labeled. Slightly later editions of what appear to be the same maps show the name diminished or absent. Researchers who have traced these changes point out that the revisions occurred in patterns that align suspiciously with periods of political expansion by Russia and other imperial powers moving east. Convenient timing, some would say, for a geographic label to quietly disappear. The memory of a great civilization begins not with conquest but with silence. Names are removed, records are reclassified, generations grow up without ever hearing the word, and eventually the silence becomes so complete that the few who do ask are made to feel as though they are the unreasonable ones. That is the first mystery of Tartaria. Not just that it disappeared, but how smoothly and completely it was made to vanish, and how resistant the academic establishment remains to even discussing the anomalies surrounding its erasure. Part 2: Architecture that defies the official story. Walk through the historic center of almost any major city built during the 18th and 19th centuries, Chicago, St. Petersburg, Melbourne, Buenos Aires, Philadelphia, Paris, and if you look carefully, you will encounter a puzzle that no one in authority seems particularly eager to solve. The buildings are too extraordinary, not in terms of aesthetic taste, which is always subjective, but in terms of sheer engineering ambition. Domes that span hundreds of feet. Stone facades carved with thousands of individual figures, none repeated. Columns rising to heights that would challenge modern cranes. Grand archways framing spaces so vast that the human eye struggles to process the scale. We are told these structures were built in the 19th century. Some of them were supposedly constructed in as little as 2 to 4 years. We are told they were built by workers using horses, hand tools, scaffolding, and sheer manual labor in eras before electricity, before hydraulic lifts, before computer-assisted design. We are told their blueprints were drafted by individual architects, who, in many cases, appear only briefly in historical records before vanishing into obscurity. Does that story make sense to you? Because when you stand beneath the dome of a 19th century American state capitol building, perfectly proportioned, geometrically flawless, surfaced in cut stone that required the kind of precision measurement we associate with industrial machinery, the story starts to feel thin, very thin. The uniformity is perhaps the most striking element. Architectural historians explain away the remarkable consistency of style across continents by invoking neoclassicism, the broad 18th and 19th century movement that drew inspiration from ancient Greece and Rome. Ideas spread through books and education, they say, and so buildings in Boston came to resemble buildings in Vienna, which came to resemble buildings in Calcutta. Trends, they argue, shared aesthetics. But the uniformity we are talking about goes beyond shared aesthetics. It extends to specific structural elements, the precise ratios of dome height to building width, the particular arrangement of pillar groupings, the placement of certain metallic ornamental features at the apex of towers and rooflines. These details appear not just across different countries, but across different cultures, different climates, different centuries of supposed independent development. The odds of that happening through simple intellectual exchange begin to seem astronomically low. Believers in the Tartarian theory argue that what we are actually seeing is architectural inheritance. These buildings were not constructed in the 19th century. They were inherited from a prior civilization, cleaned up, repurposed, and attributed to newly minted architects in order to fit within a freshly written historical narrative. The magnificent structures were already there. What changed was the story told about them. Look at what happened with the World's Fairs. Between 1851 and the early 20th century, a series of enormous international expositions were held across major cities. Chicago's Columbian Exposition of 1893, the St. Louis, Louisiana Purchase Exposition of 1904, the Paris Exposition Universelle. Each one featured an entire city of palaces, domes, towers, plazas, and grand pavilions on a scale that rivaled ancient Rome at its height. Tens of millions of people attended these fairs and returned home awed and bewildered by what they had witnessed. The official story says these cities were constructed in under 2 years, built primarily from plaster and wood framing, and were demolished shortly after the exhibitions closed. Temporary structures, that is the explanation. Now look at the photographs. Examine the resolution of carved detailing on the so-called plaster facades. Notice the depth of the architectural elements, the weight and permanence they convey. Notice how the structures appear in photographs taken years after the exhibitions supposedly ended, repurposed as warehouses, hospitals, museums, cultural centers. Many of the buildings attributed to the Chicago World's Fair were still standing decades later. At least one, the Museum of Science and Industry, stands to this day. When its plaster cladding was examined during 20th century renovations, workers found solid masonry beneath, not temporary framing, stone. The World's Fairs, some researchers now argue, were not construction projects. They were disclosure events, staged grand unveilings of existing structures that had been inherited from a prior civilization and were being introduced into the new official historical narrative through the cover story of a temporary exhibition. Build it, show it off, attribute it to industrial genius, demolish the less convincing parts, and keep what was real. It sounds extreme, until you try to explain the Chicago White City any other way, and realize that every explanation you reach for comes with its own unanswerable contradictions. Part 3: The Mud Flood and the Buried Cities. Of all the elements woven into the Tartarian mystery, none stops people as completely as the mud flood. The premise is this: at some point in the relatively recent past, within the last 300 years, possibly as recently as the early 19th century, a catastrophic event of global or near-global scale deposited enormous quantities of mud, silt, and debris across vast stretches of the inhabited world. Cities were partially or entirely buried. Populations were decimated or displaced. And the survivors, either because they didn't know what came before or because they were directed by those who did, rebuilt on top of the buried civilization and called it new construction. The first reaction of most people to this idea is dismissal. Surely something like that would be in the geological record. Surely there would be undeniable evidence. Surely it is impossible to bury entire cities without the event being universally documented. And yet, walk down certain streets in Edinburgh, Scotland, and you will find entire underground layers of city that were simply built over, with Victorian-era streets constructed directly on top of older buried structures that are still mostly intact below. The same phenomenon exists beneath Paris, beneath Istanbul, beneath dozens of cities that openly acknowledge having multiple strata of urban development. Archaeologists routinely excavate through layered cities. The question the mud flood theorists are asking is not whether cities can be buried. Obviously they can. The question is, was there a single, relatively recent event that buried many cities simultaneously, and was that event deliberately written out of the historical record? The photographic evidence is what makes this question difficult to dismiss. In cities across America, Europe, and elsewhere, 19th century photographs show extensive excavation work on city streets. But the excavations don't look like laying new pipes or foundations, they look like uncovering. Workers are seen at depths of 6, 8, 10 feet below street level, and what they are uncovering is not bedrock or soil, it is finished architecture. Arched windows at perfect eye level, still bearing decorative stonework, door frames that open into compacted earth, tiled floors buried beneath layers of accumulated material. The mainstream explanation is urban accumulation. Over centuries, city streets rise as debris, landfill, and construction material raises the ground level. This is real, it genuinely happens. Rome has been built and rebuilt on top of itself so many times that modern street level sits many meters above the ancient city. But the mud flood argument is not about ancient history. It is pointing to American cities that were supposedly founded in the early 1800s, and yet within decades of their founding, show evidence of buried ground floors and covered lower windows in buildings that should have been brand new. If a city was founded in 1820 and constructed from scratch, why does a photograph from 1870 show the lower third of its buildings apparently underground? In small towns across the American Midwest, in regional European cities, in photographs from Central Asia and parts of Africa, the same pattern recurs. Buildings with elegant, finished lower levels that appear to have been consumed by ground-level accumulation within time frames that don't match the official construction dates. Either the buildings are far older than claimed, or something happened to the ground level very rapidly after they were built. The nature of the event itself is debated even among those who accept the mud flood premise. Some point to electromagnetic phenomena, a geomagnetic reversal or solar event that liquefied surface soils across broad regions. Others suggest a combination of catastrophic flooding and seismic activity. A handful of researchers have pointed to accounts of strange atmospheric events in the early 19th century, the so-called year without a summer in 1816, widely attributed to the Tambora volcanic eruption, but suspected by some to have had an additional, unstated cause. There are reports from missionaries and colonial administrators across multiple continents describing villages and settlements that seem to have been abandoned in a hurry, whole communities found without their inhabitants, personal belongings still in place. Orthodox historians explain these as byproducts of disease epidemics, particularly the waves of plague and typhus that rolled through Eurasia in the 18th and 19th centuries. Populations were devastated, survivors fled, towns were left empty. All of that is documented and real. But what if it was both? What if there was a population decimating event, followed by or concurrent with a geophysical catastrophe that buried what was left of the old world? And what if the survivors, or those who came after them, rebuilt on top of the ruins and were either told or chose to believe that they were starting fresh? The absence of proof, advocates remind us, is not proof of absence, especially when the absence itself appears to be the result of active, organized suppression. Part 4, the energy technology they don't want you to understand. This is where the Tartarian theory moves from historical anomaly into something altogether more unsettling, because if there was a prior advanced civilization, the most important question is not what it looked like. The most important question is what it could do. Look again at the architecture attributed to the 18th and 19th centuries. Look at it not as an aesthetic phenomenon, but as a technical one. What do you notice? Enormous domes always. Domes of a very specific geometric profile, not the shallow sources of Greek temples, but the high, swelling curves associated with electromagnetic resonance chambers. Towers rising above rooflines, capped with metallic spires and orbs that have no obvious decorative logic, but bear a striking resemblance to the components of electrical apparatus. Elaborate underground systems, catacombs, tunnels, cisterns, that run beneath these buildings in patterns too regular to be purely functional. The theory, advanced by a growing number of independent researchers, is that these buildings were not merely decorative achievements. They were functional components of an energy distribution network. The domes acted as receivers and amplifiers of natural electromagnetic energy drawn from the ionosphere and the Earth's own magnetic field. The spires transmitted it. The underground networks distributed it. And the population living within range had access to a form of clean, free ambient power that required no fuel, no combustion, and no centralized utility infrastructure. Before you dismiss this entirely, consider Nikola Tesla. Not the mythology, but the documented record. Tesla, working in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, explicitly described and partially demonstrated systems for wireless energy transmission using the Earth itself as a conductor. His Wardenclyffe Tower project was designed to deliver electrical power across long distances without wires, drawing on principles he claimed to have discovered in the natural electromagnetic environment. The project was shut down. His financial backers, led by J.P. Morgan, pulled funding. His laboratory was eventually demolished. His papers were seized by the US government upon his death in 1943 and were not released to the public for decades. Tesla himself claimed, in interviews and written statements, that what he was developing was not entirely new, that he was rediscovering principles that had been understood by ancient civilizations. He spoke of finding evidence of prior, advanced technical knowledge embedded in ancient texts and architectural traditions. Mainstream science has largely treated these claims as the eccentricities of a brilliant but increasingly unstable mind. But the Tartarian researchers ask a different question. What if he was right? What if the reason his work was so aggressively suppressed was not that it was impossible, but that it was too real, and that its success would have pointed directly to the existence of a prior civilization that had already figured it all out? Consider the financial implications of free energy. Every major power structure in the modern world, governments, banks, energy companies, military institutions, is built on the control and monetization of energy resources. The ability to charge for electricity, oil, gas, and coal underpins the entire economic architecture of industrial civilization. A world in which energy is freely available from the atmosphere, harvested by architectural structures that anyone can build, is a world in which those power structures cease to exist. The incentive to suppress such knowledge is not merely financial, it is existential for the ruling class. And so we return to the buildings, the cathedral spires that served no acoustic or structural purpose, the domed state capitals that are geometrically consistent with resonance principles, the strange metallic orbs crowning towers across dozens of cultures and centuries, the underground vaults that connect buildings in ways that suggest not just passage but transmission. We are told these are ornaments, symbols, fashion choices of a neoclassical age. But the more carefully you examine the evidence, the more the official explanation feels like a very thin coat of paint applied over something much more significant. If the Tartarian civilization possessed and freely distributed energy in this form, its destruction would not just have been a military event. It would have required the complete dismantling of the technical infrastructure, the buildings, the towers, the network nodes. And it would have required the rewriting of history to ensure that no successor civilization would know what to look for, what to rebuild, or what to demand back. Part 5. The Cover-Up and Who Be Any FITS. Every conspiracy, if it is to be taken seriously, must answer one question above all others. Who benefits? Because suppression on the scale proposed by the Tartarian theory, falsified maps, rewritten histories, demolished buildings, buried cities, suppressed technologies, is not something that happens spontaneously. It requires organization, resources, and a motive powerful enough to sustain the effort across generations. The answer that emerges from the Tartarian research community points to the consolidation of imperial power in the 18th and 19th centuries. The period during which Tartaria disappears from the maps is precisely the period during which the great European empires, Britain, France, Russia, Prussia, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, were in maximum expansion. Russia's eastward expansion across Siberia was the most direct geographic overlap with the territories labeled Tartaria. The Russian Empire, under Peter the Great and his successors, pushed aggressively into regions previously described as Tartarian on European maps, and the official historical account of those territories was rewritten in the process. Peter the Great is a particularly interesting figure in this context. His reign is associated with a dramatic restructuring of Russian identity, a wholesale adoption of Western European cultural and institutional models, and an aggressive modernization program that included, among many other things, a reorganization of Russia's historical archives. Peter explicitly ordered the collection and centralization of historical records from across the territories under his control, including the regions formerly labeled Tartaria. Some researchers point out that this archival consolidation, presented officially as preservation, had the practical effect of making those records inaccessible, subject to state control, and therefore subject to editing, suppression, or destruction at the discretion of the imperial government. The same pattern plays out across other imperial expansions. When the British East India Company consolidated control over the Indian subcontinent, local historical accounts were frequently dismissed, reclassified, or overwritten with British colonial narratives. When the Spanish conquered the Americas, libraries of indigenous records were burned, the Aztec codices, the Maya libraries, gone. The conquerors in each case had the same interest: to ensure that the history of the conquered began with the conquest, so that no one could point to what existed before and demand that it be respected or restored. If Tartaria was an advanced civilization with functional free energy technology, then its destruction would have represented the greatest transfer of power in human history. Whoever controlled the narrative after that event would control the world's understanding of what was possible, what was normal, and what was allowed. They would define the baseline. And if you define the baseline low enough, if you convince everyone that primitive industrial-era technology represents the height of human achievement, you can position yourself as the provider of all advancement, all innovation, all power, literally and figuratively. The orphan trains add another dimension to this picture. In the mid-19th century, a remarkable and still poorly explained phenomenon occurred in North America. Tens of thousands of children, some accounts suggest over 200,000, were collected from the streets of New York and other eastern cities and shipped westward on what were called orphan trains. The official story presents this as a humanitarian effort to place homeless children in rural homes where they could work and be raised. And to some degree that is accurate. But the timing, scale, and geographic distribution of the orphan trains prompts a troubling question among Tartarian researchers. Where did all these children come from? Population records from the supposed origins of many of these orphans are inconsistent. Some children could not name their parents or places of birth. Many appeared not to speak English as a first language. If there had been a catastrophic depopulation event in the previous generation, a mud flood, a plague, an electromagnetic disaster, the surviving children of the previous civilization's population would have been exactly what the orphan trains collected: unmoored, linguistically diverse, culturally unplaceable children with no living parents and no documentation. Children who could be resettled, re-educated, and integrated into a new population without any link to what came before. This is speculation, it must be acknowledged as such, but it is the kind of speculation that arises naturally when you place the orphan trains alongside the mud flood, the architectural anomalies, and the cartographic erasure, and look at all of them together as a single pattern rather than separate historical curiosities. Part 6: What the mainstream will not touch. Even researchers operating entirely within mainstream academic frameworks have acknowledged that the historical record contains gaps, inconsistencies, and anomalies that the standard narrative struggles to address. Graham Hancock, whose work focuses on the possibility of advanced civilizations in deep prehistory, has made the compelling case that humanity has collectively suffered from what he calls civilizational amnesia, the repeated loss of accumulated knowledge through catastrophic events, leaving successor populations to rebuild from scratch without access to what was achieved before. His work focuses primarily on events 12,000 years ago, at the end of the last ice age. But the intellectual framework he offers applies with equal force to the Tartarian question. How much has been lost? How many times has humanity climbed toward an apex of knowledge and capability, only to have that apex erased by war, catastrophe, or deliberate suppression? The discovery of Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, a complex of sophisticated monumental architecture over 11,000 years old, built by people who were supposedly hunter-gatherers, shattered the accepted timeline of human civilizational development. It was not supposed to be there, but it was. And its existence forced a reluctant rethinking of when complex organized civilization first appeared. The lesson of Göbekli Tepe is that the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, and that the accepted timeline of human history has been revised before and will almost certainly be revised again. The question the Tartarian mystery poses is whether one of those revisions is overdue right now, and whether there are specific parties with specific interests in preventing it. The academic establishment's resistance to the Tartarian theory is itself telling. The response is not typically careful refutation with counter-evidence. It is dismissal, mockery, the label of conspiracy theory, deployed as a thought-terminating cliché to end conversations before they can properly begin. When serious researchers attempt to access certain archival records related to century history in Russia, Central Asia, and parts of Eastern Europe, they encounter institutional barriers that seem disproportionate to the sensitivity of what should be routine historical documents. Some archives that were opened briefly during the post-Soviet period have since been reclassified. Others require permissions that are practically impossible to obtain for independent researchers. Absence of access is not proof of suppression, but it is a data point, and data points accumulate. Then there is the curious case of Fomenko's new chronology. Anatoly Fomenko, a Russian mathematician and member of the Russian Academy of Sciences, published a multi-volume work arguing that the accepted timeline of world history is fundamentally incorrect, that events attributed to the ancient and medieval past were, in his analysis, far more recent than claimed, and that the historical record had been deliberately falsified during a period of active timeline manipulation beginning in the 15th and 16th centuries. Fomenko's work is controversial, disputed, and largely rejected by mainstream historians, but the extraordinary fact is that it was published by a credentialed academic at one of the world's most prestigious scientific institutions, and it was largely met with the same dismissal without engagement that greets any challenge to the official historical timeline, not refutation, dismissal. Whether Fomenko is right or wrong about the specifics, his work points toward the same disquieting possibility that the Tartarian mystery raises. The history we are taught is a construction. It was assembled by specific people with specific interests at a specific moment in time, and it has been maintained since then not necessarily because it is accurate, but because challenging it carries costs that most researchers, dependent on institutional funding and peer approval, are unwilling to pay. Part 7. The Evidence Hiding in Plain Sight. Here is perhaps the strangest thing about the Tartarian mystery. If you are looking for it, you can find it everywhere, not in obscure archives or restricted databases, in plain sight, on streets you may have walked 100 times. Go to Washington, D.C. and look at the Capitol building, not at its symbolic meaning but at its geometry. The dome follows a very specific mathematical profile, an oblate hemisphere set on a drum, capped by a lantern and a bronze statue. This profile is not unique to Washington. The identical geometry appears in the Pantheon in Rome, in St. Paul's Cathedral in London, in the Sacré-Cœur in Paris, in the Taj Mahal, in the Blue Mosque in Istanbul, in dozens of state capitals across America, in government buildings across South America, Asia, and Africa. Cultures separated by oceans, centuries, and supposedly no means of communication with each other all converged on the same precise geometric solution. Mainstream architecture history attributes this to the universal influence of Rome and the dome of the Pantheon, transmitted through the Renaissance and later spread globally through European colonialism. But this explanation runs into a significant problem. The domes that appear across Asia and the Middle East predate European colonialism by centuries. The Ottoman domes, the Mughal domes, the Persian domes, these civilizations were not copying European neoclassicism. They were working from their own ancient traditions, and those traditions arrived at the same geometric solution. Why? The most parsimonious answer is that all of these dome-building traditions drew from a single common source, a prior civilization that originated the design, perfected it, and distributed it across the world before the historical record as we know it begins. The domes are not copies of each other, they are all copies of something older. The same argument applies to the specific ornamental elements that recur across what should be unconnected architectural traditions. The double-headed eagle appears in the iconography of the Byzantine Empire, the Holy Roman Empire, the Russian Empire, the Ottoman Empire, and dozens of other sovereign entities across Eurasia that had, at various points, competed or conflicted with each other. Why would rival empires share the same symbol? The official answer involves vague claims about shared Greco-Roman heritage, but the double-headed eagle predates Greece and Rome. It appears in Hittite art from 3,500 years ago. It appears in Sumerian iconography. It appears as a central emblem on structures across Central Asia that are now claimed as part of the Tartarian cultural zone. If there was a global civilization, a Tartarian empire, its symbols would be exactly where they are, embedded in the foundations of every successor culture that grew up in its shadow, preserved in stone, even after the memory of their origin had been erased. And then there is the most personal piece of evidence, the one you carry with you everywhere and rarely examine. Language. The word Tartar in various forms appears across an enormous range of language families. In Turkish, in Mongolian, in Persian, in Arabic, in Russian, in Polish, in multiple Siberian indigenous languages, cognates of the root word for Tartaria appear with meanings that cluster around concepts of power, endurance, vastness, and connection to something ancestral and profound. Linguists attribute this to trade contact and borrowing, but the geographic and linguistic distribution of the word traces almost exactly the territory once labeled Tartaria on European maps. You cannot dismiss that as coincidence. At the very least, it tells you that the people living across that vast territory shared something, a name, a concept, possibly a cultural or political identity, that was real enough to leave its mark across dozens of separate languages. Epilogue: What have they hidden from us? We began with a question. What if everything we have been told about human history is wrong? Having followed the trail of evidence, the question now feels less rhetorical and more urgent, because the anomalies are real. The architecture is undeniably extraordinary. The cartographic record is genuinely inconsistent. The buried foundations are photographically documented. The suppression of Tesla's energy work is historically verifiable. And the pattern of convenient disasters, fires, demolitions, and archive reclassifications that seem to attend any serious challenge to the official timeline is not imaginary. None of this proves the Tartarian Empire existed exactly as its most enthusiastic advocates describe. The theory, in its most expansive form, involves elements that remain speculative: the free energy technology, the mud flood's precise nature and extent, the claim that orphan children were the survivors of a depopulated civilization. These are hypotheses. They demand evidence that has not yet been definitively produced, and intellectual honesty requires acknowledging that. But intellectual honesty also requires acknowledging something else. The official story has gaps, large ones, gaps that the academic establishment treats not as open questions inviting investigation, but as closed matters not worth reopening. When the response to a historical anomaly is derision rather than curiosity, when archives are restricted rather than opened, when buildings are demolished rather than examined, the suspicion that something is being protected becomes very difficult to quiet. Think about what would be at stake if the Tartarian theory were even partially correct. If there was an advanced civilization that possessed and freely shared energy technology, its rediscovery would upend the economic basis of the modern world. If it was deliberately destroyed and its memory deliberately suppressed, that destruction was the original crime, the act of theft from which all subsequent theft follows, the moment when a small number of people decided they would control what humanity knew, what humanity could do, and what humanity could imagine. Every limitation placed on human freedom since then would trace its roots back to that moment. That is why the Tartarian mystery is not a trivial curiosity for internet researchers. It is a question about the deepest structure of power: who decided what we know, who benefits from what we don't know, and what becomes possible the moment we stop accepting the story we have been given and start asking what was taken from us. The maps still exist in archives and rare book collections, showing names that were never supposed to survive. The buildings still stand in city centers around the world, their geometry quietly encoding principles that official science pretends not to recognize. The buried foundations sit beneath our feet in dozens of cities, waiting for anyone patient enough to excavate and honest enough to report what they find. The silence in the textbooks is itself a form of testimony. Tartaria may have been erased from the maps, but it has not been erased from the world. It is in the stones. It is in the domes. It is in the symbols carved into the faces of buildings that were standing, in some form, before any of us were told they were built. It is in the questions that keep rising no matter how often they are dismissed. History is written by the victors, but the stones remember everything. What do you think was hidden from us? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because the more people ask this question, the harder it becomes to keep the answer buried.